Hello my friends, thank you for joining me today. So, recently, I've been getting absolutely spammed with requests to respond to a video from a gentleman named Andrew Huberman who recently decided to upload a 2-hour video discussing the subject of hair loss. I expected this, of course, because over the years, my channel, it's developed a bit of a reputation for being a source not just for hair loss information, but also a source for debunking hair loss misinformation. Some of my most popular videos of all time, in fact, have been the videos I have made where I've debunked people for spewing Broscience misinformation online, such as What I've Learned, Rob English, HairGuard, Danny Roddy, and Atigen. So, even though these videos do tend to get more views than most of my other videos, and oftentimes people do find them entertaining, you guys may be surprised to know that I don't particularly enjoy making these videos, and it's not because these videos take a lot of effort to make. I mean, that's fine. I am okay with hard work. But the reason I don't like making these reaction videos where I am forced to debunk outdated bro science about hair loss is because I usually prefer to look forward towards the future of hair loss treatments and not to the past. And that's because there are a lot of reasons to be optimistic about the future of hair loss research and therapies, and I have covered much of this on my channel. However, when you have a platform as large as Andrew Huberman spreading misinformation about hair loss science to an audience who are likely laymen on the subject, it pulls hair loss research back a generation or two, since we're forced to address subjects that have already been scientifically dismantled, as Derek from More Plates, More Dates would say. But what makes this especially damaging is that Andrew Huberman himself is a man with very impressive educational credentials. He has a PhD and is a Stanford neuroscientist who has made significant contributions to his field of expertise. So, he's not a fake doctor like Eric Berg, who's only considered a doctor in the Church of Scientology.
Are you not aware that I graduated top of my class?
Dr. Huberman runs a website called the Huberman Lab where he posts his podcast and offers premium features to his subscribers for a fee. He also endorses a wide range of unproven supplements on various websites. So even though he's clearly a very smart guy, he has a little bit of a Dr. Oz vibe about him since Dr. Oz is a trained medical doctor, yet he unfortunately promotes a lot of unproven woo and supplements which he sold in order to raise money so he could run for the Senate last year in the state of Pennsylvania as a Republican, where he ultimately lost against his Democratic challenger, Vulcan Raven from Metal Gear Solid. Dr. Huberman tends to also make a lot of podcasts about subjects that are well outside his area of expertise, which is neurobiology. You may think this is a bit of an unfair contention, but I am definitely not the only one who has noticed that he sometimes appears to cover these subjects in a superficial manner, while at the same time using his expert credentials to lend authority to what he is saying. So, while he has definitely made some quality content on other subjects, you can't assume that just because he's a scientist that he cannot be wrong about hair loss. If you look at the hierarchy of scientific evidence, there is a very good reason why expert opinions are listed close to the bottom, and that is because having scientific credentials does not relieve you of your responsibility to accurately interpret and provide evidence-based research for whatever argument you are making. After all, if Stephen Hawking could be wrong about black holes, then Andrew Huberman sure as hell can be wrong about hair loss. In fact, in his new video on hair loss, he is more than just wrong. He is horrifically wrong, and he frankly debases himself with this video. I have seen and enjoyed some of Andrew Huberman's other content, but this hair loss video is inaccurate, pseudoscientific, lazy, gish-galloping drivel, and as a content creator who has such an influential and large platform on YouTube, it was tremendously irresponsible for him to expose his audience to so much misinformation that could ultimately hurt them in their own struggles to fight hair loss. So, when I said Andrew Huberman was gish-galloping, I wasn't kidding. The data Huberman goes over is mostly very poor quality, but there is an overwhelming quantity of it, and sadly, just like when What I've Learned cover the subject of hair loss, I am once again forced to play the role of janitor and clean up this stain that has encrusted itself in the hair loss community. There's a lot to clean up here, so let's not delay any further and go balls deep on this travesty of a hair loss video. Well, a 2-hour video is like a feature-length film pretty much, so I'm not going to go through his whole video line by line. He does spend a lot of time talking about the hair loss cycle and hair stem cells and so on, which is nothing controversial, and to his credit, he does do a very good job of breaking down the anatomy of the hair follicles as well as the physiology of the hair growth cycle, so I'm not going to waste my time on that since it's not really contentious. He also interrupts his podcast with sales pitches from his sponsors, which include a mattress company, interestingly enough, as well as several types of supplements. So unless those companies want to give me money too, I think we'll go ahead and skip over all that. Although, On a completely unrelated note, I have to admit, my back is feeling great today. And ever since I switched over to purple mattresses, I haven't woken up with back pain yet. Anyways, we'll go ahead and skip over his ads and his breakdown of the anatomy of the hair follicle, but what we won't skip over is what is probably the biggest piece of Broscience in this entire video, and that's Dr. Huberman's obsession with the obsolete, discredited, pseudoscientific hair loss theory known as the Bludflow theory.
Blood flow, increase blood flow to oxygen and blood flow itself, more blood flow.
Reduction in blood flow.
Andrew Huberman is so convinced by the Bludflow theory that he even says you shouldn't wear a hat or else your hair will fall out.
That should cue you to why so many of the stories around how to keep your hair and regrow hair involve statements like, don't wear a hat, it'll make your hair fall out. Or if you want your hair to grow back, don't wear hats, or massage your scalp, or increase blood flow.
The theory that hats interfere with blood flow and cause hair loss is one of the earliest known examples of a hair loss theory being debunked. It's such an old theory, in fact, that it was debunked way back in 1916 by a scientist named Dorothy Osborn, who is old enough to be Andrew Huberman's great-grandmother. This was way back in 1916, and back then, the blood flow theory was only taken seriously since we didn't have tools to measure things like hormones, which we now know today are the real culprits in the progression of androgenic alopecia, hence why it is called androgenic alopecia, since it is caused by the androgen DHT. That is why if you look back at newspaper advertisements from the late 19th to early 20th century, you can find a lot of ads about devices and gimmicks that are designed to improve blood flow to the scalp. Modern day versions of these scam gimmick products exist today, such as the Grow Band from HairGuard, or specific scalp massage programs promoted by grifters like Rob English. Anyways, Dorothy Osborn was a pioneer in the field of hair loss research, since she was the one who first showed that baldness was an inherited condition and that it had nothing to do with hats constricting blood flow to the scalp. Dr. Huberman sadly tries to resurrect this obsolete theory by saying that treatments that increase blood flow obviously work because hair follicles need a lot of oxygen. He literally doesn't cite any research at all to justify this. He just expects us to take it in on faith that things that increase blood flow will subsequently increase hair growth, even though this theory was debunked over 100 years ago. Now, I've done several videos debunking the blood flow theory and why maneuvers like scalp massages don't work, and I'll link them below. But to give you a summary of it all, the blood flow proponents argue that people lose their hair because they have a tight layer of connective tissue in their scalp called the gallia apnerotica, and that this tissue compresses the blood vessels in the scalp. This layer of tissue is held tight by the muscles of the head, like the frontalis and temporalis muscles, and the blood flow theory supporters, they basically think that by massaging these muscles, you can loosen up the tense scalp and improve blood flow and thus promote hair growth. When it was found out that androgenic alopecia was associated with higher DHT in the hair follicles, the blood flow theory lost traction as a serious hair loss theory, so its proponents were forced to modify the theory to account for this newfound data about DHT and hair loss. As a way of moving the goalpost, if you would, the blood flow proponents proposed that low blood flow caused low oxygen levels that then subsequently caused reduced conversion of testosterone into estrogen and hence more conversion of testosterone into DHT. However, the concept that low oxygen levels lead to higher DHT levels is just a hypothesis, and it has never actually been shown to be true. In fact, there's far more evidence that the blood flow theory is completely wrong. For example, the blood flow theory proponents get the anatomy of the scalp blood vessels incorrect. The blood vessels of the scalp don't run under the muscles or under the gallia apnerotica. They actually run on top of these layers, so factors like muscle tension or scalp tension won't inhibit blood flow. Also, we know that the blood supply to the scalp is very redundant, meaning that there are multiple different arteries that go to the scalp, not just one or two. In fact, there's a fairly common surgical procedure, which is the tying off of the superficial temporal artery, and doing that causes no hair loss despite removing completely the blood supply of a major scalp artery. Blood flow is reduced in bald scalps, but this is a consequence, not a causation of balding. When you lose hair follicles, you also lose the capillaries that supply blood to those hair follicles. So total blood flow of the scalp goes down with balding, but that is an effect of the balding process and has nothing to do with causing hair loss. Even more evidence against the Bludflow theory, though, is the fact that hypoxia, meaning low oxygen levels, actually stimulates hair growth, which is the opposite of what the Bludflow theory proponents predict. Again, I went over all this in a previous video that I'll link below, but this article that you can see here shows that conditions of hypoxia increase the enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase that stimulates the growth of dermal papilla cells. So if anything, it is low blood flow and low oxygen levels that stimulate hair growth, not enhanced blood flow. In fact, there is even a hair growth stimulant on the market today called Minoxidil that specifically works by mimicking a hypoxic environment in the scalp, which in turn stimulates hair stem cell activation and hair growth. So the idea that a lack of oxygen works as a stimulant for hair growth is not only theoretical, but it has practical applications too. If the Bludflow theory were real, then Minoxidil would cause hair loss. It wouldn't promote hair growth. The final nail in the coffin for the Rob English fanboys who say scalp massage enhances blood flow is the fact that massages don't even enhance blood flow to begin with. In this article here, massage of arm or leg muscles had no effect on blood flow. So even though everyone who promotes scalp massages claims that massage promotes blood flow, there is really no evidence that it does. And in fact, the evidence that is available indicates that it doesn't increase blood flow, and there's no reason massage would improve blood flow in the scalp if it doesn't improve blood flow in other muscles of the body. So, despite all this, Dr. Huberman accepts the Bludflow theory without any qualms whatsoever. He even believes that the reason Minoxidil works is because it increases blood flow, which is something not even Rob English believes.
For instance, one of the longest standing treatments for halting and reversing hair loss is so-called Minoxidil. Minoxidil, sometimes also referred to by the brand name Rogaine, was actually a drug that was developed to treat hypertension. So this is a cardiac drug that lowers blood pressure, and it does that by causing vasodilation. It allows more blood flow, not just to the hairs on your scalp, but to hairs everywhere on your body.
It turns out that researchers actually think that this is the least likely mechanism for how Minoxidil works. The exact mechanism of how Minoxidil works is unknown, but it is almost certainly not due to its vasodilating effects that increase blood flow. The leading theories of how Minoxidil works includes its effects on stimulating hair growth factors like VEGF and certain prostaglandins, as well as a direct effect on a specific cellular potassium channel. The most obvious reason that the vasodilator effect of Minoxidil isn't what causes hair growth is that nearly all blood pressure pills dilate blood vessels and increase blood flow, but only Minoxidil was found to cause hair growth. In fact, since Minoxidil was developed as a blood pressure pill, the fact that it also had a side effect of causing hair growth caught researchers by surprise because they weren't expecting it. So the fact that Dr. Huberman just casually connects Minoxidil to blood flow and blood flow to hair regrowth just shows what a superficial look he took at the body of research on hair growth that exists today. He then goes on to say that people should avoid Minoxidil because it can increase prolactin levels.
Because some of those side effects, in particular the fluid retention and the hyperprolactinemia, can be pretty uncomfortable and can disrupt a lot of aspects of life that most all of us consider desirable.
He provides no scientific evidence for Minoxidil causing increased prolactin levels whatsoever, but ever since this video, people have been in full-blown panic mode about Minoxidil, and I have been getting questions every day asking about Minoxidil raising prolactin levels. The fact is, though, is that what Andrew Huberman is saying about Minoxidil and increased prolactin levels is not true at all. In fact, in the original studies of women on topical Minoxidil, no increase in prolactin levels were seen. Also, from the FAERS FAERS database of post-marketing drug side effects, only 3 cases of increased prolactin were reported out of 18,000 reported side effect events on Minoxidil. There are some blood pressure drugs that affect dopamine in the central nervous system and thus can affect prolactin levels. However, Minoxidil is not one of these drugs. There is no evidence that Minoxidil affects the central nervous system in humans, so it does not appear that Minoxidil affects prolactin levels at all. So this argument that Minoxidil is dangerous because it increases prolactin levels is completely unsourced, and Andrew Huberman doesn't show any data that it actually affects prolactin levels at all. So, despite this complete lack of evidence, Dr. Huberman tells people to avoid Minoxidil and then seek out an alternative growth stimulant, even though topical Minoxidil is both FDA approved and the strongest growth stimulant on the market today. So, what is Dr. Huberman's idea of an effective Minoxidil alternative? It's caffeine. He claims caffeine is just as effective as Minoxidil.
But I do think it's important to mention caffeine because of the lower incidence of side effects, at least reported side effects, and the general safety margins and the head-to-head, essentially comparable efficacy with Minoxidil, because Minoxidil has a bunch of other issues.
In the description section of his video, Dr. Huberman links 2 studies on caffeine and hair loss. One is a review article on caffeine for hair loss, and the other is an in vitro study of the effect of caffeine on cultured human hair follicles. Now, I did a video on caffeine a long time ago, which I'll link below, but to sum up the evidence on caffeine, caffeine maybe can stimulate some growth factors that can induce hair growth, and there is a small study showing that caffeine was comparable to 5% minoxidil in its effect on hair growth. However, that trial used as an endpoint the ratio of the number of anagen growth phase hairs to telogen resting phase hairs in the hairs that were plucked from the subjects. The study did not actually look at hair counts or hair density as an endpoint, which is a more usual endpoint for this kind of study. Also, the investigators were employees of the company making the caffeine solution, so there was a very obvious conflict of interest here. The bottom line, though, is that at best there is some evidence that caffeine might be a mild hair growth stimulant, but there is not nearly enough evidence to conclude that it is a substitute for topical minoxidil. I think using a shampoo containing caffeine is fine, but Dr. Huberman is inflating the evidence when he says that caffeine is just as good as minoxidil and you can use it instead of minoxidil. There isn't nearly enough evidence to qualify that claim, and this is one of the many examples in the video where his bias towards more natural remedies and against medications like finasteride and minoxidil is very evident. So let's move on to the next supposed trump card that the Bludflow people pull whenever their arguments get debunked, and that's the infamous Botox argument.
Botox injections can be applied to the scalp in order to relieve tension of the scalp. And in hearing that, it should be obvious why Botox is being used to try and offset hair loss. It's decreasing the squinting, if you will, or the tensile nature of the scalp skin so that more blood flow can arrive at that stem cell follicle area.
Now, botulinum toxin is the strongest poison on planet Earth, but that doesn't stop it from being used cosmetically in very tiny doses in order to relax forehead muscles and get rid of brow lines. So the proponents of the Bludflow theory have tried injecting Botox into the muscles around the scalp in order to relax these supposedly tense muscles and thus improve blood flow. Well, some preliminary data did show some hair growth after Botox injections, so the Bludflow fans were absolutely ecstatic because they thought that this data finally legitimized all the bullshit they'd been peddling for so many years. However, as it turns out, Botox does a lot more than just relax muscles. In this report here, it was actually found that intradermal Botox downregulates the negative growth factor called TGF-beta1. TGF-beta1 is upregulated by DHT in androgenic alopecia. It's one of the downstream effects of DHT, in fact, that helps destroy our hair. So Botox was found to have a biochemical effect that negates the effects of DHT, and this has nothing to do with muscle relaxation or scalp tension or blood flow, since the theoretical mechanism behind Botox has nothing to do with its muscle relaxing properties. Now, people like Rob England and others have objected to this idea that Botox injected to the muscles of the forehead and the temples is the same as the intradermal injections of Botox into the scalp. They say that if Botox injected into muscles diffuse such a great distance, then people would have a slack jaw after a Botox injection, so therefore blood flow has to play a role somehow. However, the distance between the frontal and temporal muscles of the scalp is much, much shorter than the distance to the jaw, so it is very likely that even intramuscular Botox could diffuse that very short distance. This isn't just speculation on my part either. In fact, the very authors of the intradermal Botox study anticipated this argument, saying, quote, "Considering the diffusion of the injected liquid Botox in scalp anatomy, even the intramuscular injection may indirectly inhibit the secretion of TGF-beta1 from dermal papilla cells in the hair bulb," unquote. So even these researchers feel that the Botox effect on hair growth has nothing at all to do with the Bludflow theory. But even more damaging to the Bludflow theory is that there is evidence that repeated Botox injections can actually cause hair loss. You wouldn't expect that to happen if increased muscle relaxation caused more and more blood flow. The more blood flow, the better, right? So I guess relaxing those forehead muscles and improving blood flow isn't as great for your hair as the blood flow proponents make it out to be. Or what's more likely here is that Botox injections don't even improve blood flow to the scalp to begin with, since there's no evidence blood flow to the scalp increases after Botox injections. And even if it did, we already have shown that increased blood flow has nothing to do with hair growth to begin with. So this is yet another example of Dr. Huberman promoting an unproven treatment for hair loss at the expense of other proven treatments like minoxidil and finasteride.
And one way that people are doing that is through mechanical stimulation of the hair follicle and the stem cell niche using what's called microneedling.
Next, he brings up microneedling for the treatment of hair loss because, of course he does. He says microneedling has been shown to reactivate hair stem cells in the telogen resting phase and put them back into the anagen growth phase and thus stimulate hair growth. He also says that it can augment hormone-based hair regrowth tools. So the reality of microneedling is that microneedling is virtually useless. Literally the only thing microneedling has ever been proven to be useful for is improving the absorption of topical minoxidil, and it probably does this just by creating channels in the skin in order to enhance penetration of the drug. However, the data supporting using microneedling as a standalone treatment is extremely weak, and there are also some potential dangers with long-term microneedling use. I went over a new negative study on microneedling as a standalone treatment in my last video that I'll link below. In fact, 4 out of the 7 studies that have been looking at standalone microneedling treatment have shown no benefit from microneedling whatsoever. Even worse though, microneedling is associated with occasional complications and its long-term effects are completely unknown. I went over all that in my video titled The Dark Side of Microneedling that I'll also link below, but since I just did an update on microneedling in my last video, I won't waste any more time on this part of Dr. Huberman's video, but just know that microneedling is extremely overrated, ineffective, and potentially dangerous. Even its one proven benefit, which is improving topical minoxidil's absorption, isn't worth it since there are far safer and more effective ways to make minoxidil more effective, such as using Tretinoin, which I made a video on, which I'll also link below. So, when Dr. Huberman finally gets to finasteride, it is disappointingly, but not surprisingly, mostly just a fearmonger about it, and then he goes on to promote other more natural 5-AR blockers like saw palmetto as a viable alternative.
And that's why I singled out saw palmetto as one of the few for which the biochemical pathway of inhibiting 5-alpha reductase and the low incidence of side effects and the fact that many people have used it with some degree of success makes it a standalone, I wouldn't say recommendation, but a consideration.
So he's worried about getting your DHT too low, so he recommends saw palmetto and maybe a low dose of finasteride on top of that to top it off. He talks a lot about saw palmetto, which is a very weak 5-AR blocker like many other botanicals, like for example reishi mushrooms, which I did a video on that I'll link below. In any case though, doses of finasteride over 0.1 milligrams per day cause hair growth, but also reduce serum DHT by about 60%. A dose of finasteride of 0.01 milligrams per day, however, only reduces serum DHT by 11%, it does not increase hair growth. So there is a certain threshold effect on DHT suppression that is probably around 40 or 50% that is needed in order to promote hair growth in androgenic alopecia sufferers. And botanicals like saw palmetto that are just weak 5-AR blockers don't achieve enough DHT suppression to do any good. So adding saw palmetto to finasteride like Dr. Huberman suggests is not going to be any more effective than just using finasteride alone, so it would be a complete waste of time and money.
Dihydrotestosterone binds to the androgen receptor at 5 times the affinity of testosterone. So it is the most powerful androgen in humans. And it is responsible for a number of things that we all really want and like, such as mental vigor, physical vigor, strength, healing capacity, drive, libido, and on and on.
So he's worried about lower DHT levels that he claims is needed for male virility, but this is a common trope amongst DHT simps who think that DHT is a vital hormone in order to maintain our manhood. However, this is not the consensus amongst scientists at all. In this article on DHT from 2022, the important roles of DHT in fetal development, childhood, and puberty are outlined. However, in adults, quote, DHT does not play a significant role in the normal physiology of adults. The most notable effects are prostate enlargement and male pattern hair loss as they age, unquote. Now, I've done a whole video series on DHT being a trash hormone in adults, and I'll just link that below if you want to look at all the evidence as to why DHT only causes trouble and has no redeeming qualities in adults whatsoever. But the bottom line is that DHT is not necessary at all for male virility. It only does bad things.
So there isn't a clear conclusion about what post-finasteride syndrome is really all about, but it points to the fact that DHT is likely to be involved in development of the brain and the brain to genital axis, because I mention that because so many of the side effects that are associated with this post-finasteride syndrome seem to center on sexual side effects, although there are also the depressive side effects. Of course, those can be related to one another.
He then brings up post-finasteride syndrome and talks about symptoms of sexual dysfunction and depression, but he bizarrely links post-finasteride syndrome to decreased DHT levels. Now, even the PFS network is more sophisticated than that because they claim that post-finasteride syndrome is due to altered levels of neurosteroids like allopregnanolone, which are synthesized by the 5-AR enzyme. The problem with this supposed link between neurosteroids and finasteride, though, is that in human beings, finasteride blocks predominantly the type 2 5-AR isoenzyme, while the human brain contains almost exclusively the type 1 isoenzyme. In rodents, finasteride acts as a type 1 blocker, so a lot of the studies on the effects of finasteride on rodent behavior are not at all applicable to human beings. In addition, PFS proponents point to decreased neurosteroids in the cerebral spinal fluid of subjects who are complaining of depression supposedly caused from post-finasteride syndrome. However, studies show that neurosteroids are altered in depression from any cause, so this does not prove a link between neurosteroids and finasteride. I've discussed this in numerous videos, which I'll link below, but Dr. Huberman doesn't even mention neurosteroids once at all in his videos. Instead, he feels that post-finasteride syndrome is due to decreasing DHT levels. The problem with that is that studies of PFS subjects have shown that DHT levels are normal in people complaining of PFS symptoms. There is no evidence that PFS is due to decreased DHT levels. So, Dr. Huberman seems to have taken a very naive and very superficial approach to his studies on PFS and on hair loss in general. So overall, like most supplement salesmen, Dr. Huberman is interested in overhyping the risk of FDA-approved medications and overhyping the benefits of so-called natural treatments. He does not show evidence of a deep understanding of this particular topic. I suspect that he does profit from supplement sales, though, and that is probably his primary motivation for making his videos. Now, I don't know this for certain, but I think a possible motivation for him suddenly getting involved in the subject of hair loss is that his company may be planning on releasing some sort of snake oil hair loss supplement, which I'm sure will have saw palmetto and all the usual junk we see in every other natural remedy to treat hair loss that doesn't work. It may just be that Dr. Huberman is gaslighting about actual FDA-approved treatments like finasteride Minoxidil, since those drugs will ultimately become competitors for whatever bullshit hair loss product he intends to sell. Of course, this is all just speculation. It could very well be that he is just genuinely interested in the subject of hair loss, and maybe he just went down a Broscience rabbit hole that led to all the bad information he presented in this video. Now, I would of course never question Dr. Huberman's competency. Like I said, he knows how to interpret research, and the beginning of the video where he goes over the science behind the anatomy of the hair follicle as well as the growth cycle was genuinely excellent. However, I get the impression that Dr. Huberman is a bit of a contrarian. He seems to be the type of person who always thinks there is some lesser-known explanation that most people have missed somehow, or that maybe Big Pharma is covering it up. I say this because he really grasps for straws while presenting his points about all these obscure and hypothetical issues regarding finasteride, minoxidil that have no concrete evidence, while at the same time ignoring the mountains of data that show that both of these drugs are safe and effective. There is definitely a place for contrarians in academics, but it is important to also acknowledge that oftentimes the experts are right and that the weight of scientific evidence supports the fact that finasteride and minoxidil are both safe and effective drugs, and that there is no place for debunked, obsolete theories like claiming hair loss is due to Bludflow or claiming that DHT is really important without providing any scientific explanation as to why. Dr. Huberman, if you are watching this video, you have a tremendous opportunity to provide millions of people with quality information about hair loss. I think you should cover this subject again, but perhaps with greater reverence to the scientific data, and stop trying to invent your own theories or resurrect obsolete theories about hair loss. I know there is probably very little chance that you will watch this video since you have over 300 times the amount of subscribers that I do, but who knows? I know Derek from More Plates, More Dates has seen some of my content since he has commented on my channel before a few times, so perhaps there is hope that you will see this video and maybe change some of your unfounded opinions about hair loss remedies. I mean, I may not be some fancy pants PhD, but I am a hair loss switcher, and I'd like to think that counts for something these days. So this was obviously a long video, so thank you to all those who watched to the end, and I'll see you all next time. God bless.